many thanks for joining all of the attendees, which is up to 146, which is really great. I think pregabalin is fairly new on the scene as a street drug. I imagine there'll be drugs workers who will be wanting for extra information they can use to offer guidance to service users who use drugs. I wonder if there'll even be some medics for whom it might be new news that this is a prescription drug which is used in non-medical contexts as well. So great to see the many people introducing themselves here. Many thanks for joining. So I'll briefly say a very little bit about these webinars in case anyone is new. So we've been doing these for about 5 years now. Started off as in-person events only, then COVID, and then we started doing these, aiming for them to be monthly, although they don't really end up being monthly. We explore different issues around drugs. This time it's a particular drug. Sometimes it's more of an abstract issue about a drug. Myself or Professor Joe Neal or Professor Chris Chandler take it in turns to host these, and then we get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 experts to present their research findings, their knowledge, their experience, whatever they do. And so what will happen today is I will introduce our 4 expert guests together who will all present their opening gambits of their knowledge base, their experience, any research on this, and then it'll be more of a discussion. And so your questions will kind of guide what will hopefully be quite a kind of organic discussion. Okay, so if we can start. So Caroline, thank you very much for joining, also at very low notice. I think it was quite recently I asked you to participate in this. So Caroline, if you could please introduce yourself, what you do for work. If you could maybe just give us a little bit of an opening about what pregabalin is, what family of drugs it's from, what it does, and then tell us about your research on this, your research findings.
Yes, thanks, James. So I'm Caroline. I am a senior lecturer in pharmacology and toxicology at King's College London, and I run a research group there that does a variety of things, but a lot of it stems from data that is reported to the National Programme on Substance Use Mortality, or NPSUM, which I run. And this is a database of deaths which is reported to by coroners across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We have about 85–90% coroner engagement. So some of the figures I'm going to show to you here, whilst they look bad, the situation's actually worse because we haven't had every death reported to us. But anyway, so I'm going to just briefly give you an introduction to what pregabalin is as a drug. To put simply, the way that our brain cells communicate with each other is one releases a chemical onto the other, and that chemical activates the next one. And it's this sort of chain reaction of then that neuron, nerve cell communicates the next one. And what pregabalin does is it stops that release of chemical from one nerve cell to the next one. And so it inhibits communication. Now, it was actually originally developed to treat epilepsy along with sister compound gabapentin. And I think you can probably understand why. Epilepsy is too much activity in the brain. And so pregabalin is acting to stop this activity by stopping these chemicals from being released. So, it makes sense for epilepsy. But then when pregabalin was being tested in clinical trials, it was also found to be actually quite good at treating neuropathic pain. So this is specifically pain, like damaged nerve pain. So if somebody has had an amputated limb, for example, you'd be damaging the nerve, but also things like chronic back pain as well. But what we've seen is some of the prescribing of pregabalin and gabapentin has gone beyond just neuropathic pain to other pain conditions, which isn't actually licensed to treat, but it's also not very good at treating as well. So that's not great. So it was licensed for neuropathic pain and epilepsy in the early 2000s, and about 10 or so-ish later, it was also then licensed for treating anxiety. Again, you can sort of imagine, Anxiety might be due to sort of overactivity in the brain. So if pregabalin can sort of stop some of that neuronal communication and calm things down a bit, it can act as an anxiolytic. So a fairly new drug in terms of prescribing, only really available since the early 2000s, and quite a diverse range of things that it is now prescribed for. So I'm going to be talking to you about some results that we published in this paper, which was published a couple of years ago now. But what I have done for this presentation today is give a little bit of an update with the figures that have happened since 2020. So this is what we had in 2020 in terms of deaths following pregabalin and gabapentin use. And one of the things to point out is gabapentin was actually available first. It was the first marketed of the two. Gabapentin works in a very similar way to pregabalin, but pregabalin is the one that was introduced second, but there's always been far more deaths with pregabalin detected than gabapentin. Now, we know that pregabalin is favoured by people who use drugs because it's more potent, essentially, than gabapentin. More of it gets into the bloodstream when it has been used, taken by mouth, and then more of it can act more strongly to stop that nerve communication from happening. And what we have is, since 2020, is I suppose it's good in some way that we've had a levelling off of deaths with pregabalin and gabapentin detected. But we're looking at around about 1,000 deaths a year. And remember, I said we don't get every death in the UK. And so there's going to be, more than what we have here. So something that looks bad is probably actually even worse. You might wonder what happened in 2019 that might have caused that jump in detections in 2020. There was, of course, the COVID pandemic, which changed all sorts of drug use behaviours. But one of the things that did happen in 2019 was it was actually scheduled, or both of them were. So the scheduling system in the UK, the Class A, B and C system, pregabalin and gabapentin in the April of 2019 became Class C substances. And they were also put on, as I think, a Schedule 3 drug, which means that you can't get them easily on repeat prescription and as if it's a Schedule 4 drug. But this doesn't seem to have helped in stopping the number of deaths where it was detected being found, which is not good. So what might be the mechanism that is causing some of these deaths to happen? So it could be simple overdose, but we don't think that's actually what's happening. Graham Henderson did some experiments a number of years ago now, looking at the interaction of pregabalin and gabapentin with opioids. And what he found was that people who use opioids, they develop a tolerance to the drugs, and it means that in order for them to feel the same effect of the drug over time, they have to keep taking more and more of it. So the tolerance is building up, so they're having to take more of it to feel the same effects. And what Graham showed was that pregabalin and gabapentin can reduce this learned tolerance. So what might have been previously a tolerated amount of opioid that you were taking, now you're taking it with the pregabalin, it's suddenly turning into overdose territory because that tolerance is being reversed by taking the pregabalin together. Some people were using this in combination deliberately as sort of a cost-saving approach. If you can get the same high from your opioid by using less of it, why wouldn't you do that? So you wouldn't have to take as much of your drug. And when we have a look at the deaths that have happened, opioids were co-detected in over 90% of the cases where either pregabalin or gabapentin were detected. And the original analysis that we did showed that in 25% of the deaths, both the pregabalin or the gabapentin and the opioid had actually been co-prescribed to the individual, which is quite an alarming number, considering that we now know there is an interaction between the two, which makes people more susceptible to opioid overdose, and that in an alarming number of cases they've actually been given together. Okay, I think that's my sort of 10 minutes, James. Is that okay?
That's very, very okay. So thank you very, very much for that. Yeah, very, very interesting, albeit very, very, very morbid stuff. But now move on to Mance. So Mance, thank you very, very much for joining. I think, and what is it, 9 o'clock in the morning for you?
It's 8.
8. So thank you very, very much for getting up very early for this. And thank you very, very much for joining. So yeah, I think you might be the first person to publish something noting street non-medical use of pregabalin and also other gabapentinoids. So yeah, please do fire away, Mance.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Bruce Buttram. I am a public health professor at the University of Arkansas. And me and my team have been looking into non-medical use and diversion of gabapentinoids since about 2016. Especially because of the North American context, we are interested in use of these gabapentinoids in the context of opioid use disorder or among people who use opioids. That's really where we see a lot of this problem coming. I'll kind of go over briefly, and I think the introduction from Dr. Copeland was so perfect. In the United States, pregabalin is a Schedule 5 controlled substance, and we did not have a generic version of pregabalin until July of 2019. So, in addition to controls on prescribing, it was also very expensive. So, for that reason, we didn't see a ton of pregabalin prescriptions dispensed. So, the most recent data I have are from 2022. Pregabalin is the 91st most prescribed drug in the US, with about 7.1 million prescriptions dispensed. And gabapentin, on the other hand, is very different. It was historically thought to not really have any abuse potential and to be very safe. And in the US, it's prescribed off label quite frequently. Everything from treating mental health problems, substance use disorder, any kind of physical pain, even if it's not kind of a neuropathic pain. Part of that is in response to the opioid crisis in North America, where prescribers are trying to get away from prescribing opioids. And so as a result, and also just to mention, gabapentin is not a controlled substance at the national level. Since 2019, 7 states have made it so. But because of that kind of historical context, it's not scheduled, and there was a generic available. Gabapentin was very cheap. So it's always been in the top 10 most prescribed drugs. And in 2022, there were about 40 million prescriptions dispensed compared to 7 million for pregabalin. So when we talk to people who use drugs, when we look at big surveillance data, gabapentin is really kind of what we see more than pregabalin, but they're used in the same ways. So we just wrapped up our second study of people who use non-medically use gabapentinoids and who are also using opioids. And what we saw in the study reference there, we had about 62 people in that first study. All of them reported non-medically using gabapentin in addition to opioids. Just 5 of those also reported non-medically using pregabalin. And there are a few reasons, motivations for that. One individual, a young woman, reported using about 300 pregabalin pills per month. And her main motivation was to really potentiate kind of this opioid euphoria, to try and achieve a desired psychoactive effect. But we can contrast people non-medically using these gabapentinoids kind of to potentiate that opioid euphoria. We also had about a third of people in that sample that reported non-medically using simply to kind of self-treat. So whether that be physical pain, mental health problems like anxiety, depression, or even try to treat opioid withdrawals or self-treat opioid use disorder. So those are really kind of the motivations, this like euphoria piece, but also the self-treatment piece. Part of that, again, is kind of this North American context. Some of those people who are simply trying to self-treat physical or mental health problem maybe don't have access to healthcare or don't have insurance to pay for care. So that's kind of some of that motivation there. So for us, really, we see a lot more gabapentin just because it's easy to obtain, easily diverted, and there's just so much of it kind of floating around. Whereas pregabalin is really just more tightly controlled. The other thing I'll add, in the US, pregabalin is not approved to treat anxiety, so we don't see it prescribed for that purpose. Although the sister medication gabapentin is prescribed off-label quite often for things like that. So yeah, I'm happy to, as we get into the discussion, kind of provide additional context or talk a little bit more about those, answer any questions that you all may have.
That is awesome. Thank you very, very much. Now, after doing my small pre-intro to Josh and Chris, I will do it again. So thank you very much for joining. Chris, thank you very much for joining for your first time. Josh, thank you for your perhaps fifth or sixth street drugs contribution. So thank you, Mance. I'll now pass it over to Josh and Chris. So
yeah, sure. Thanks, James. And thanks, Joe Sands. And thank you, everybody, for being here. My name's Chris Rintoul. I'm the head of harm reduction for Cranstoun, which is a UK drug treatment provider. My background as a social worker, usually or normally in Belfast or other parts of Northern Ireland as well. I've worked with lots of people who've had difficulties with a range of drugs, including, in particular, pregabalin, and less so gabapentin.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for giving us your time and attention. As James has made clear, I'm basically old news at this point. Yeah, I'm working as a kind of drug harm reduction and drug policy consultant. And pre-gabs, gabapentinoids, have kind of kept on coming up on my radar. And I think that's quite telling. And I think it's telling that there was a struggle to find people interested enough in the topic to discuss it today, because I think, as we can all tell, pre-gabs are everywhere. But no one seems to really be looking at it in great focus, apart from essentially the people presenting today. But yeah, I look forward to talking to you all. And I think it's probably best, Chris, do you want to start the presentation?
Yeah, okay. I have been furiously editing these slides because we didn't realize, and Caroline's covered some of what we were going to, so forgive us being a little bit disjointed here, but we're probably going to focus more on the kind of harm reduction stuff and how to manage withdrawal, which is a real big issue for people who've become dependent, whether they are sometimes prescribed amount or they're used illicitly or street source ones. So yeah, just a little recap. So the most common are pregabalin and gabapentin. Pregabalin is more potent than gabapentin, and for that reason, I think that's why I tend to find more people seeking them. I'm not talking about people who are prescribed legitimately by their GPs or their pain specialists, etc., but by those who are seeking for other effects. They're usually known as Lyrica or pregabs. In Northern Ireland, they're known as buds, which is a reference to the 300 milligram tablets, which are red and white in color, similar to the kind of the colors on the Budweiser tin, and also a hint that it gets you a little bit drunk, as if you're drinking alcohol. In terms of pregabalin, they come with lots and lots of different strengths of capsules, and that's helpful from a dose titration point of view, and also when people are reducing down or trying to stop or stopping. In the UK, the strongest prescribed dose is 300 milligrams, but there are stronger variants in other countries, and some of them have been making their way to UK streets, in particular 450 milligrams in more recent times. One key thing just to know about them is that tolerance does develop rapidly, and then you'll probably see that there's a lot of similarities between pregabalin or gabapentinoids broadly, generally, and also the benzodiazepines. Pregabalin is in particular fairly similar, in my experience anyway, to diazepam. And that's part of the story about their popularity, is what's happened with prescribing and availability of prescribed diazepam in recent years. So dose escalation and dependence will follow after a prolonged period of use, or even a fairly short period of use. So the effects, and again, that's been mentioned, or these have been mentioned by the other speakers, but euphoria and relaxation is fairly evident, particularly when people don't have tolerance. Clumsiness and confusion, sedation and slurred speech. So you're hearing stuff which is very similar to the benzo, very similar to alcohol as well. Loss of memory and blackout, and an overdose, coma and seizures can happen. Josh, you want to take this one?
Thanks very much. Some of this is kind of reiterating what Caroline's already said. But as we have seen the number of pregabalin prescriptions go up, the number of people being prescribed pregabalin go up, we've also seen the number of people, unfortunately, having pregabalin mentioned in their death certificate going up as well. And it's interesting because we can see as gabapentin prescriptions plateau, we also see the number of people who have gabapentin mentioned on their death certificate also plateau and even drop slightly. But with pregabalin, it's quite a different story. We've just seen a kind of continuous rise. And it's interesting when you look at the two graphs alongside each other, because you're basically looking at the same graph, which is kind of, frankly, really quite concerning. And I think that speaks to the impact of prescription trends. Okay, I don't want to lay too much responsibility at the feet of medical professionals here. We can't know for sure the proportion of the pregabalin supply which is being diverted from medical prescriptions and the proportion which is being bought through illicit channels. And I'll talk a bit more in detail about that in a bit. But either way you slice it, it is very clear that the initial rise in gabapentinoid prescriptions, pregabalin in particular, helped foster a drug use culture and kind of helped foster an appetite among the British public for these drugs. And so in an indirect way has kind of contributed to the problems we're seeing associated with these drugs. If I could have the next slide, Chris. And I think it's worth making clear that the problem really is, I would say, is kind of worst of all in Northern Ireland, where pregabalin is mentioned on just over a third of all drug death certificates. That's between 2018 and 2022. And if you look at the UK as a whole, you can see the number of death certificates on which gabapentinoids are mentioned, pregabalin in particular, going up alongside a substantial rise in the overall number of drug deaths. Now, there's loads of factors that have been going into that rise, but I think it's perhaps an understudied topic. To what extent is throwing gabapentinoids into the mix, particularly people who are combining it with a bunch of other depressants, to what extent is that actually contributing to that national rise in drug deaths? This is an impossible question to answer to an extent, but I think it is a topic that definitely needs more focus among kind of people within the sector. So, when I talk about throwing it into that mix, in treatment we have a term, fearsome foursome, and this Venn diagram kind of illustrates that really well. It's very common for people to drink alcohol alongside their depressant of choice, be they benzos, be they opioids. Gabapentinoids have kind of really fit well into that kind of mix of depressants, which is particularly popular among kind of unstably housed cohorts in particular, although, there's kind of a very broad range of different types of people using these drugs. I think it's worth making clear that although, it is right to focus on, and it's a generalization, so I feel a bit uncomfortable making it, but it is right to focus on that kind of unstably housed cohort, because that is where we see this, this really quite large number of drug deaths. There are actually quite a broad range of different cohorts that are using pregabalin in particular. I actually got off the phone earlier today with an old friend who is involved in, kind of quite a middle class kind of warehouse queer chemsec scene, and they all use pregabalin as their daily driver. That's kind of their drug of choice. They actually use it as a chemsex drug because it apparently enhances their libido, which slightly surprises me, and delays orgasm. So they find it to be like a very effective chemsex drug. I think it's important to make clear that that's unusual. It's not some new emerging trend or anything like that. But it's just important to make clear that there's quite a wide range of people using gabapentinoids for quite a wide range of reasons. So I just want to talk a little bit about the illicit market. As I said, we don't know, what proportion of the all the gabapentinoids being taken out there, what proportion are actually prescribed, what proportion are diverted prescriptions, and what proportion are purely illegal channels. I'd say it's quite likely that they are coming from the same factories. So the illegal supply of pregabalin, and you don't really see gabapentinoids being sold illegally quite so much. That will be coming largely from country India mainly. And so, probably it will be the same factory that makes legitimate pharmaceutical products will then kind of do a night shift off the books is what you're generally looking at. It's important to make clear that the vast majority of that trade is being done face to face. But the handy thing is that online drug markets are quite visible. You can have a look at them, which is great for drug researchers. And I had a quick look on Telegram and a darknet marketplace, which interestingly just got busted last week. And there were I found 10 different pregabalin brands available across 14 different vendors. So it's quite freely available. I'd describe it as a niche drug. It's not being sold by even 10% of vendors. You had to kind of look around to find someone who was selling it. And the going rate, if you were to buy 150 300 milligram tablets, was about £60. So you're looking at about 40p. I think it's important. It's interesting because someone in the chat earlier said that they spoke to someone who had bought 200 300 milligram tablets for £200. That to me sounds like quite a high price. I would expect that you could generally buy 10 pills for a tenner. You're generally looking at about a quid a did, I guess you could say. But obviously the price does kind of vary quite a lot depending on the context. I think the next slide is you, Chris.
I want to walk you through a little bit of a historical story, and it's the reason that we have such issues with pregabalin in Northern Ireland. Historically, we had a very high rate of overprescribing, as it was called, of benzodiazepines. So at one point in time, for every 100 prescriptions for diazepam in the UK as a whole, there were 211 written here in tiny little Northern Ireland. So it was quite a significant rate of prescribing, I guess. And it wouldn't take a genius to work out why that was. It was to do with the conflict and the legacy of the conflict that went on for decades here. But anxiety didn't disappear once the Troubles ended. And people were very dependent on diazepam and other benzos as well. So it became increasingly difficult for people to get those prescriptions legitimately. And there had been a culture that had developed for a long time. I mean, if you remember back the little phrase, mother's little helper, that tells you a lot about what diazepam is in certain communities. It's a drug which has been widely shared if you were bad with your nerves, basically, and somebody bound to have diazepam, and you'd be given a wee tablet, a wee yellow or a blue or a white even. So that's the kind of the historical context, and that's not only evident in Northern Ireland, it's also evident in a lot of parts of Scotland, and there's a lot of different parts of the UK which are more socioeconomically deprived, and you'd see that same sort of pattern there. So the northeast of England would stand out there as well. But along came pregabalin, and whilst people hadn't managed to overcome their anxieties, and benzodiazepine withdrawal, as you know, is very, very difficult, can even be dangerous, and very protracted. So this drug stepped up, or pregabalin specifically stepped up into that mix as an alternative where prescribers could prescribe that for generalized anxiety disorder. It had also been prescribed for a long time in the prisons over here. Neuropathic pain is something that you can't really test for. So if you say, doctor, I've got a bad back here, they're shooting pains down my leg, there you go. there's Pregabalin. So that started in the prisons and then sort of leached out into the community after people got released. And we saw that sort of heading into these sort of communities in Northern Ireland, which had been ravaged by conflict and were endemic in terms of the amount of benzo prescribing that went on there. So this basically filled that void because prescribers were far less willing to prescribe diazepam in the way that they had to in the past. This young lad here is called Kenny. There's a program about him. So, if you know enough about Pregabalin, you probably know already that Northern Ireland was the kind of the test bed, I suppose, for problematic use, and had been going on for a long time before it seemed to really sort of become more evident in other parts of the UK. So there were, media stories about Belfast's heroin users topping up with Pregabalin. Vice did a good one on that. And then this one was one of the Drugs Map of Britain series. I think it's nearly 10 years old. This young lad, Kenny, was a guy who was seen on camera bumping a capsule off the back of his hand on film, which he just collected from his prescriber, his GP. As soon as that film went out, unfortunately, his GP contacted him and said, come down, collect the script for a week, you're out of our surgery, go find somebody else to prescribe you. And that sort of sent him into a bit of a spiral. It ended up, sadly, that program having quite a negative impact on his life, partly because I think the film producer was daft enough to show something like that, which is going to evidently cause problems if the prescriber sees it, which of course he or she did. So that kind of led to some other difficulties for me. He got put out of his home by some of our organised crime groups who didn't like some of the other stuff he was saying and connecting Pregabalin to things that are kind of political issues over here. I think he ended up in a pretty sorry state as a result of that. So it was certainly a lesson to me about be very wary of the media, even if they don't mean to cause harm and difficulty by their own naivety and stupidity. Actually, they can. So this poor lad really did struggle after that. So he was going through withdrawal. He was, no GP, and he had to leave his community because he was threatened and had to leave that. I don't know how things are for him now, but certainly in the aftermath of that program viewing, it wasn't great for him. So supporting people who use Pregabalin, this is the basics, and many people I think on this webinar will know these very, very well, but it might be useful to do a quick recap. So telling people or working with people and saying, we know for reasons that you use Pregabalin, and what are they? That curious, respectful, asking of questions, developing a therapeutic and so people. But equally also mention what are the downsides? What have you found that has caused some difficulties for you, for your relationships and your employment, so on and so forth. And then what's your goal? What do you want to get out of this work that we're doing together? And how can I be that kind of vehicle for you to help you meet that goal that you've set? There's a lot of withdrawal symptoms with Pregabalin. And I partially know about these because for a number of years, I was prescribed Pregabalin after an unfortunate accident with a lorry, and it kind of wrecked my back for a number of years. And so this was one of the medications that was tried. And I'd say of all of them, this was the only one that really was significantly difficult stuff. That was prescribed doses, not overusing, all that sort of stuff. And it had a hell of a stimulant tail, I can assure you. So you can read that for sure. The intensity of those and the severity of those symptoms will vary person to person. Depends also on how long somebody has been using that for, and maybe other things that they're using alongside as well. But it's difficult for anybody, and that's for somebody that's using that's prescribed, not for somebody who might be using massive doses.
Thanks, Chris. I always find it interesting how different people find withdrawal from different drugs difficult or easier. And there doesn't seem to be any real rhyme or reason to it. If you look at Dr. Adam Winstock's recent work, he's been posting on LinkedIn, kind of a hierarchy of withdrawal. Pregabalin is placed well below benzos or opioids. But it depends who you speak to. Some people find it easier, some people find it harder to get off. And I've spoken to people who will basically pick up Pregabs over the weekend. They'll create a dependence and then spend a couple of days or weaning themselves off and then kind of go back next week. And so they're kind of taking themselves on and off pregabs almost once a week, which seems kind of strange to someone who's not in that situation, I guess, but apparently it's worth it to them. I'm just going to talk quickly about withdrawal. So basically, with depressant drugs more generally, and I'm aware that the action of pregabalin on your glutamate is actually quite different to most depressants. It acts on your kind of calcium channels, but essentially, if you depress your glutamate levels, that's the kind of electricity in your brain that makes you kind of wake up and fired up. If you depress that over a long period of time with drugs, when you take the drug away, your brain overcompensates with the seesaw because your brain is always trying to find balance. And so for a time, glutamate levels will be much higher than you really want, and that's quite unpleasant. And that can, the symptoms of that can range from just feelings of anxiety and tension right up to seizure. That's what, when someone has way too much glutamate, they're in seizure. But what you can expect is just a sense of kind of rebound anxiety in general. And it's some people report a feeling of agoraphobia, so they want to stay inside. They don't really want to be outside in wide open spaces. There does seem to be a risk of psychosis with people kind of getting paranoid thoughts or even hearing voices. Obviously, this is often kind of like interlinked with underlying mental health issues anyway, which have often fed into the reason why they got into pregabs in the first place. And so, if you are using a crutch, say for your mental health, and then you remove the crutch, your mental health symptoms might be like quite exacerbated for a little while. So obviously it's always very contextual, and it's always very difficult to pick apart exactly what's going on. To be honest, it's not so important, the root cause. It's more just about dealing with what's in front of you. And so, the extreme end of that is seizure. So, I think in terms of advice, the person can feel like they are in crisis. And I think it's important to give them perspective to make sure they're aware that these feelings will pass. Yeah, this is temporary and it will get better. Even 3 days from now, you will feel significantly better and significantly less in crisis than you do right now. And Steve O'Neill, no, I'm not a medic. Harm reduction advice. So basically, it's largely similar to what you would say to someone with who's taking benzos, which is quite handy if anyone, pregabs are kind of often seen as quite a niche drug, even if they're actually not in reality. But people often have quite a good set of knowledge around benzodiazepines, benzo harm reduction, and you can mostly copy paste your understanding and knowledge of benzos onto kind of pregab use, really. If you're not in dependence, it's really, really important that you avoid that with regular breaks. Like the people I was talking about who kind of get into it in the weekend, they take themselves off over a Monday and Tuesday, and they're taking those breaks at least. They're at risk for sure of something going wrong in their life and they're going to end up in a kind of a more serious habit. But they are at least taking the steps to kind of avoid that kind of heavy dependence. Obviously, that's not really realistic for someone who's on a high daily dose. We're going to look at tapers in a minute. There's often other drugs in the mix. It's the other depressants, we've talked about this already, which kind of really makes that dangerous. It could be some people, you can say, look, can you just cut out the other depressant, whatever that is? And actually, often pregabs is the other depressant, right? The actual real drug of choice might be heroin, for example. So sometimes the best harm reduction advice is, look, can you just kind of drop the pregabs? Is that something that seems feasible to you? If it's not, I think it's just important to give advice to use smaller doses of each and make sure you space them out. This is the most important thing. A lot of people will kind of apply both at once. And if you just say, look, can you just make sure you wait a few hours? You have some kind of even loose regime in your mind about what your kind of plan is for tonight. That can just really help keep people safe and outside of that kind of overdose threshold. And just try and always increase the intervals between your doses. Just push yourself a little bit further. Can I just wait a little bit longer? It's good advice for all drugs, to be honest. Avoid snorting or injecting. Stick to oral. It's actually very bioavailable in the stomach. There is really no need to snort it, other than the fact that it will hit you quicker. But it's generally less efficient, right? So it's actually quite an easy sell to tell people to stick to swallowing. And, it's worth testing your drugs always. A lot of the time, the cohort you're speaking to who are on pregabs, they're maybe not the kind of guys who are going to send mail off to Wednos, and that's fair enough. It's interesting looking at the Wednos results. It is mostly pregabs. We have seen nitazines and pregabs present in the same samples, but not being sold as pregabs. It's worth having a look on the WEDNOS results. And then Cranstoun call it a staying alive plan, but basically have a plan in place for overdose. Who's around you who can check up on you? Just these real basic things.
So we've been thinking there about kind of the basic harm reduction advice, and this is sort of part of that. So you have to remember from prescribed levels of use, you need to know what the kind of the stable daily dose is, or you need to know what the daily dose is, you know, to even get to this point here. So that's important to think about. But you can see here with decrements of 50 milligrams per week or fortnight or monthly, somebody could achieve getting down the way. And this is a suggested NHS table plan. I think it's from Fife, actually. Stopping taking anything can be difficult, particularly if people have a bit of a tablet fixation, which many do. So it will take some time for people to get used to that, to overcome that anxiety that, oh no, what am I going to do without this, you know? But achieving a stable daily dose is the absolute minimum. If I had 2 rules for Pregabalin, is don't become dependent and don't yo-yo your dosing if you have become dependent, and things are a lot easier if both of those things have occurred. Capsule splitting could be essential if it's not prescribed. Generally, if it's prescribed, you can prescribe it down to 25 milligram doses and way up to 300 milligram doses. So it's, you know, it's less of a problem for Pregabalin, I guess. Tapering with people is a really anxious time, particularly as we're closer to the end of that taper, and it becomes more difficult each dose reduction or each decrement as you get towards the end. But there's also this funny time where somebody is getting towards the end, they are in withdrawal, it's still pretty unpleasant no matter what you do, it's, you know, they're still experiencing it. And for some people, what they say is, look, it's better just to drop off from here. So instead of dropping down to 25 milligrams per week or for a fortnight or a month, I'm just going to drop off from 50 and that'll be it. And, you know, that's perfectly achievable, but the point is really that it's at that person's behest of what they want to do.
So yeah, just a quick recap, I guess. You know, pregabs are popular in part thanks to a kind of established awareness of them, but it's primarily because of their ability to potentiate other downers, as has been said a lot today, and they're cheap, right? Price is always one of the biggest drivers of a popularity of any drug. You know, the explosion in ketamine use that everyone's talking about in the media at the minute, that's largely because it's cheap. It's gotten cheaper. So when something is a quid a did, it can be hard to argue, I think, especially when someone isn't a high earner. But, you know, with that combination with other downers comes increased risk, and that's kind of really where, I guess, the harm with pregabs comes, as well as the kind of physical dependence that they build. If someone has reached that level where they have a dependency, it's just important to try and maintain that stable dose, which can be difficult if their life is chaotic, you know. And, you know, if they're not dependent, just try and keep taking breaks. And, you know, any tapering plan needs kind of careful consideration. It's always worth trying to do that with a healthcare professional, trying to get on prescription if possible. But just being aware that progress is non-linear. I guess medical systems can often be quite rigid and not kind of understanding of this, that people, they slip up, they make mistakes, they go forwards, they go backwards, they go sideways. And it's important to just be flexible when you're working with real people with real lives that don't conform to your, you know, lovely utopian vision of recovery. But yeah, that's it from me and Chris. Thanks a lot for listening. And yeah, I'm looking forward to questions.
Great, thank you very, very much. And yet also very much looking forward to the Q&A, very often the best bit. So Ibukan Mary Opa Jimmy asks, when people use pregab, what effects are they hoping to get? And we've heard a few disparate things, so I might try and put it all together and see if anything's been missed. So I believe Chris mentioned them having a drunkening effect on people. Also mentioning that acting similarly to benzodiazepines. Also, Josh mentioned a fairly niche use of people involved in chemsex. But yeah, what else have I missed there in terms of what are the reasons people take Pregabalin? What are they hoping to get from them? That can be to any of the panel. So just unmute yourself and start talking if you wish to have a go at that one.
I think you covered them there, James. The only one I'd add to that would be they're a cheap way to boost the effects of, you know, poor quality heroin, or someone whose tolerance to heroin is really high and they're not getting much out of it anymore. So that would be a key one to remember, because they tend to be at the highest risk of overdose and death.
Yeah.
I think I'd chuck in there, when you're thinking about kind of younger pill poppers, anxiety, non-prescribed self-treatment for anxiety.
I would agree with that. I would say we see people talking about self-treatment of mental health problems like anxiety quite often. And the second thing is treating opioid withdrawal or symptoms of opioid use disorder, especially if they're not able to access or not ready to access treatment. Those are the two kind of non-high seeking motivations that we see.
Awesome, thank you very much. I was actually just about to ask if people use them to assist with heroin withdrawals, and the answer is they do. But anyway, I'm actually going to move now to quite a different question, and I'll bring Caroline in first for this one. I think it's a very good question. And one which
I think Caroline might have. I just said sorry, I'm going to have to go. So I
Oh,
don't know if
okay.
she's
So
still
I
on the
didn't
call.
notice that. Thank you very much. So one thing I'll move on to then is something I think, to pick up on something you just said, Josh, there. You mentioned that as well as looking at, so one group of people who are using pregabalin are people who might have also been using heroin, people who live in unstable or supported housing, and that certainly fits with people talking about pregabalin use in research interviews that I've done. You also talked about pill poppers, which is interesting. Would you say is that quite a new type of person using drugs in the UK? And can you tell us a bit more what you mean by pill poppers, what other drugs they do, and whether you think this is a new or established practice in the UK? And then I'll probably move on to Mance's experiences in the United States with pill poppers.
I would discourage anyone from using that term. I should not have used it. I was kind of broadly referring to younger people who take downers in pill form, thinking really about oxycodone, pregabalin, maybe like more niche types of opioids, which are increasingly popular, like tapentadol, red apples, drugs like that. But I think Mance will probably have some real good insight into that, because that's a kind of a much bigger culture in the US than it is here.
Thanks, Josh. And I find it very interesting how and why this might be taking off in the UK at the moment. But Mance, can you tell us more about that in the US, and especially how it fits in with some of your other non-specifically pregabalin or gabapentinoid research?
We do see that. I would say that kind of use we see more among maybe younger people earlier in their drug use careers. It's kind of an experimental thing. And we see that too as people might kind of start initiating opioid use, whether that be with pills like an oxycodone or even start using benzos. Gabapentin especially is one of those drugs that's always kind of floating around. So it's an easy thing to just take alongside of other pills that you may be taking. And then we do see people later in their drug use career maybe experiencing opioid dependence or addiction. And that's when kind of word of mouth starts happening, and people say, oh, we'll start taking these medications, pregabalin, gabapentin, alongside of any opioid, to kind of help with potentiating the opioid euphoria. So we really see kind of two distinct kind of ways that people come about it. But the other thing too is, here in the US, diversion is quite common and quite easy, especially for a non-controlled substance and a very cheap substance. So it's easy just to come about it and try and experiment.
Thank you. I've got a question I'll put straight back to you, Mance, before then throwing it on to Josh and Chris. Mary Donovan said, can you say something about prescription supply versus illicit supply? And do we know how the illicit market operates in the UK or the US? And is it always obtained and taken in tablet form? So, Mance, to clarify, in the US, as you see it, nearly all of the use is essentially someone was prescribed the drug, either to the person who's taking it or someone is prescribed it and then they sell it, divert it, gift it? Or are there more, or is it being made in factories and diverted in a fully black market fashion?
No, I would say because there's so much supply in the US, it's probably coming from prescriptions.
Mm.
In our latest study, we asked about kind of illicit gabapentin that wouldn't come from a prescription source at some level. Counterfeit gabapentin, we don't really see that. We do see the majority coming from prescriptions. So about a third of people will report having their own prescription. And then everyone else, about another third, might say friends, family that have a prescription that they can easily access. And then we also see street dealers that will sell it. It maybe not today as much, but in recent years, it's not uncommon for someone to receive a 90-day supply. So because of that, it enables people to have kind of a stockpile. So they can sell that to a dealer who can resell it in the informal market, or someone might have, 180 pills, 180 days worth of supply because they're not taking it every day and they get these 90-day prescriptions. So they have a stockpile there they can easily share. That's really where we're seeing a lot of the diversion come from in the US.
Yeah, noted. And also, is it the case where you think most of those prescriptions were initially given legitimately, and someone simply stated their symptoms and they came, or is it a bit of a thing where, yeah, say the magic words and you get a massive pre-gab prescription?
What I hear from people who use drugs is that that's not necessarily something they're seeking out to go and try and get a prescription for. Gabapentin in particular is primarily, most of those prescriptions are off label. So things like mental health problems, any kind of physical pain, even if it's not a neuropathic pain. Even people get prescribed sometimes in treatment for substance use disorder or when they're in a recovery residence after leaving treatment. They're still getting prescribed that to help with restless leg syndrome, things like that. So no one is necessarily going and trying to get a prescription like they might for an opioid medication, but it's easily something that kind of can be prescribed for a multitude of reasons. So it's easy.
Noted. Thanks. So I'll pass that also. So I guess now to Josh and or Chris, how would you say that compares to the UK situation? What Max has told us about availability and distribution in the US?
I think I'll take that one if that's right. I think it's important to preface this by saying that a lot of this is speculation, right? Illegal drug markets don't want to be detected or measured, so we don't have full information. It will be a mix of all the above, though. In general, prescriptions for these types of drugs are much tighter in the UK than the US. They always have been. I would say, putting my finger in the wind, that diverted prescriptions, while there's plenty of that going on, they're not about to begin to kind of satiate the overall demand. I would say that there is plenty coming from illicit sources. I would assume, as with other drugs as well, that much of that is being made in legitimate factories. Some of it will be being imported under some kind of medical license into the Europe, at which point it will kind of disappear and end up being sold illegally. But probably quite a bit is being created by the same factories illegally and being brought into the UK illegally. Pills, you make powder and then at some point someone puts it into pills. Sometimes that will be happening. I'm just going to say India, but there'll be a number of other countries involved as well, predominantly India. In some cases, those pills will be being made up in India and it will be being imported into Europe in pill form. And then also being imported into Europe in powder form and being put into pills in the UK. It's actually surprisingly easy to download exact blueprints of legitimate pharmaceutical packaging. Pharmaceutical companies are required to upload a blueprint of their packaging online, which is great for people that put together pills. And all the braille, everything can be printed on quite easily. So sorry if that was a bit of a vague answer, but the answer really is just a mix of everything depending on how the supply wants to work.
No, that's useful. Thank you very, very much.
I took a slightly different meaning to that question, so if you don't mind, I'll just respond a little bit or briefly on it. I think the main places you'll see people who struggle with pregabalin, not necessarily those who are prescribed, because that's a slightly different group or a very different group, but people that are in prison, people who have come out of prison, people who are rough sleeping, people who are living in temporary accommodations. That's the real at-risk group, and people who live by themselves, of course, as well, especially if they've got a long history of opioid use, probably heroin. They're the people that I am more concerned about. You will have the young people that will, take a whole pile of, and I think I read a question there, I read a comment there, which is very sadly about a young teenager who passed after using gabapentinoids. I think it was pregabalin, but that was co-use with oral opioids. And of course, we know that's a much more risky profile when people combine it with other types of drugs. So that notwithstanding, those previous groups are the high risk ones that we need to be thinking about and how to help.
Noted, thank you. And I'll get another one I'll put straight back to you, Chris. It's a longish question, but a good one that I'll read out. We have plenty of people who are being prescribed MAT, presume that's a methadone therapy, unless I've misunderstood, by drug services, drinking regularly and then being prescribed GABA on top by their GP, despite the letters shared by doctors to warn them of the MAT prescribing. What more can be done to change MAT's prescribing decisions and support people to move away from the risky combination? So yeah, do you see it as a problem where people are prescribed both methadone and pregabalin, which increases risks? Do you have anything, or do you recognise this prescription issue or recognise anything that can be done about it?
In some of our research, we did a subsample of people receiving either methadone or buprenorphine to treat opioid use disorder. And what was described in some of the qualitative research was, this is a quote, gabapentin is oil and buprenorphine is fire, and that combination can really be a powerful and enticing one. I will say in the United States, there's been labeling changes for gabapentin. I think it was always on pregabalin labeling, specifically warning against co-prescribing any opioid, including methadone, along with one of those gabapentinoids. So I think that has kind of changed the way prescribers think about it, especially for people in those treatment settings.
So I think I haven't got an answer to that, to be honest. Obviously, it is a concern if people are co-prescribed, maybe by different prescribers, methadone, buprenorphine, and also perhaps by their GP being prescribed a gabapentinoid. That needs to be very carefully thought out because we know that particular risk there. But I also want to highlight and point out something which is a bit difficult to say, and it can be a bit challenging, but we need to remember that the reason people are prescribed or have got used to these drugs, the gabapentinoids, is the same reason they got used to benzodiazepines, is the same reason they got used to barbiturates way back. And it is from the prescriber's pain. And I suppose my perspective, looking from the outside and not as a prescriber, is that it is very easy. It's almost the opposite of what the question was about. It's very easy for prescribers to sort of stand back and say, okay, right, there's been this new directive. We've got our knuckles wrapped by Department of Health or whoever, we're not allowed to do this anymore. And then they get these sort of big standalone signs in GP surgeries. We do not prescribe pregabalin or diazepams that don't even ask for it or worse to that effect. But really what that does is it pushes the risk back on with the individual. There needs to be more accountability as a profession by the prescribing community in how do we be part of the solution to the problem that actually they started.
Yeah, I think you're dead right, Chris. And I just want to pick up on something I said earlier when I was talking about increased prescription levels. That really was only because doctors were finding it very difficult to prescribe diazepam for anxiety and opioids for pain. It became increasingly difficult for them to do so. There was lots of red tape and more and more restrictions. And so they just needed something else to fill the gap, because people need drugs. People need to be prescribed something to help treat either their pain or their anxiety. And it turns out the drugs that do that get you high and form dependence. And that's what we call in policymaking a wicked problem. There's not any kind of easy solution to that. If it's okay, I'm just going to run away for a minute with this question that Katrina asked, which is, does it stop working for anxiety after taking pregabs for a long time? Bit of a tangent, but it's a really, really, really interesting question, because although obviously the pregabs are effective, they make you stop feeling anxious when you take them. Obviously, they don't address the root issue. And I think there is often a paradox with drugs that work to treat a symptom, potentially making the overall condition worse in the long run. And, coming off the drugs makes you really anxious as well. So there's kind of often downsides when you're prescribing drugs to kind of treat any kind of symptom.
I'm not so sure they become as ineffective as benzos do if they're prescribed a long time. We know that they can make the original symptoms worse. So, for example, somebody prescribed diazepam for anxiety, most certainly years later, that anxiety will either be worse or no better than it was initially, and then withdrawal is going to make that a lot more difficult. I'm not sure, and this is from a personal perspective, I'm not sure that actually follows in the same way with pregabalin, although I have no evidence to say it's more of a personal perspective than opinion.
Great, thank you very much for all of that. Next question I was going to ask is, we'll go back to Mance. Someone asked about fentanyl and the relationship with it. I presume that if fentanyl and opioids interact, and heroin interacts badly, then fentanyl and pregabalin interact very, very badly. But Mance, do you have anything on that at all?
Yeah, you are correct. Because fentanyl can be so much more potent, risk of respiratory depression and overdose does increase, especially if you're fentanyl naive or don't have the tolerance. I will also note in the United States, we really don't see hardly any heroin at all. It's almost all illicit fentanyl. So that's kind of one of the big risks that we see. Yeah.
Noted, thank you. And I know Josh mentioned earlier about nitazines, but possibly, I think you were saying that it's a bad idea to mix pregabalin and nitazines, although obviously people very rarely know they are using nitazines. And I think you mentioned they've only been found together in one sample, but that sample was not being sold as nitazines or pregabalin. It just happened to have both in them. Keeping on about interactions and about more of the street use, a couple of questions about pregabalin and crack. I noticed you said heroin is out the window and you only get fentanyl in the US. How much crack is still about, and how much has kind of meth taken over the illicit stimulant market in your view?
Yeah, kind of in this fourth wave of the opioid epidemic in the US, we're seeing a big rise in stimulants. So that is primarily methamphetamine, but we are seeing other illicit stimulants like cocaine or crack cocaine.
Mhm.
In our research studies, we've had people describe using these gabapentinoid drugs sometimes to try and come down from these stimulant highs that they're experiencing, especially if it's something like meth where it goes on a little bit longer. So that's kind of the relationship that we see there. Also, co-use of opioids and stimulants are very common right now. So especially if someone's already accustomed to combining an opioid and a gabapentinoid, then sometimes it's a third, a stimulant on top of that.
Chris, were you going to add something there?
But just in response to the crack use with pregabalin, I can imagine that is probably, going to increase because, after a crack binge, it's very difficult to parachute down, without something more sedating, obviously, than crack is, So people commonly use benzos to do that. And if benzos are less available, whether prescribed or illicitly sourced, then I can see pregabalin becoming a popular alternative to that. But it's just to remember that the reason people are doing that is to come down off that, that cliffside, I suppose, rather than falling off it, some form of parachute.
And it's interesting to see someone in the chat as well mentioned about how they have seen. I work at welfare in festivals quite a lot, and I have not seen this, but someone said that they had seen a lot of. I think they said a lot in capital letters, so take that as you will. People at festivals using pregabs to ease the come down of, not crack, but kind of other stimulant drugs, which is interesting. It makes a lot of sense to me. I can totally imagine that it would be quite effective for that.
Yeah, well, I guess it's perhaps concerning to that end that this stimulant drug is very cheap, it's very available. It seems that it really takes off among populations who've heard of it, but very few people have heard of it. I bet if we went round a festival asking people what pregabalin is, they were thinking it was like a made-up drug from Brass Eye or something. But perhaps worrying that there are some people who find it very useful for medicating come downs at festivals after night clubbing and raves, that there's a lot further things can go with it. Actually, another question. A bit of a mixed message from harm reduction courses. On the one hand, prescribe these meds to aid tapering, but then, as we heard today, that if there's no prescribing, there would be less dependence. I think that relates to something Chris said. And going back to Chris, a question from Judith Yates. I also wonder if Chris Rintoul thinks it might be safer to go back to more benzo prescribing instead of pregabalin. As he says, medics moved from barbiturate prescribing over to diazepam, as we were told it was much less harmful, and now we are told to move from benzos to pregabalin. But should we be going back again?
Right. The answer to that isn't entirely linear, and it's still my opinion rather than established fact. But my thoughts on it are, for people who are not already prescribed pregabalin or use pregabalin, it's not a good idea to start them on it unless there's very, very good kind of justification for that. The problem is more so about those who have already been prescribed, and what I certainly witnessed here, especially when it came to benzodiazepines and the deprescribing of them across a nation, a small nation as Northern Ireland is. That was always going to end up playing badly. That was always going to end up into the kind of the street scene, the illicit supply of things, etc. And so I don't think we want to really be tiptoeing any further in the same sort of direction when it comes to gabapentinoids. However, if people are prescribed gabapentinoids, I think there's an under-awareness, that's even a word, of the difficulty of withdrawal. There are people who describe it as much more difficult than an opioid withdrawal and just as long-term as a benzo withdrawal. That, I'm sure, varies between person to person, but it should give people that are working with those who are dependent on pregabalin or gabapentin, well, an awareness that you need to tread carefully and you need to be thinking about this as a long-term thing and not sort of rushing ahead with something just because there's been this kind of drive to drive down prescribing gabapentinoids.
Noted, thanks. And I'll pass that back over to Mance again. So you mentioned the idea of kind of there was a panic about overprescribing of opiate painkillers in the States, and then in some places there was a really dramatic cut in it. So there's a very journalistic book called Dreamland by Sam Quinones about the parallel takeoff of OxyContin and a particular illicit heroin distribution model that happened. I found it a very, very good book. If anyone thinks there's stuff wrong with it, do let me know in the chat and I'll stop saying I think it's great, but I really enjoyed it. But yeah, Mance, so you mentioned that you believe that the vast majority of American pregabalin use comes from someone being prescribed it and most likely in fairly good faith. Do you think there are relations between pregabalin use in the US and an overprescription or very drastically curtailed prescriptions of opiate painkillers?
That's a good question. I think it might be more gabapentin. So as we've seen fewer opioid prescriptions, we've seen some evidence that we have seen an increase in gabapentin prescriptions as prescribers seek an alternative medication that's thought to be safer. I also saw just recently a few data points from some researchers at the University of Kentucky who found that of the 7 states where gabapentin was made a controlled substance, it's not at the national level, but in those areas, they once it becomes a scheduled controlled substance, it's prescriptions tend to go down. It's harder for prescribers to do that. And they saw that diversion or people obtaining diverted gabapentin actually increased. So to go back to Josh's point, it doesn't actually stop use. It just changes the way that people would obtain the medications that they want or need.
Got a few questions now, which were one. I should tell you what Richard Zarconi asks. Noting the various doses from 25 to 300 milligrams, what is the common range normally used? Say, what do you say some mean or median street use? Mance, what has your research in America said to that?
I actually can't answer that for pregabalin. I would say for gabapentin, to achieve that kind of psychoactive effect that someone might be looking for, it's around 3,000 milligrams.
3,000 milligrams.
Yes.
Yeah. And
a typical dose might be like 300 milligrams.
Note a typical dose 300, but for many an effective dose needed at 3,000. Got that right?
Yeah, something above 2,000 milligrams for sure.
Yeah. Chris and/or Josh, what would you say is the kind of typical street date? I guess there's much variation in how it's used, whether people are using it weekends only, daily, dependent. But what would you say is a typical daily illicit dose?
Nearly everybody I've seen, it's 300 milligrams twice a day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you get people who are on less, 150, 200, 225 twice a day, that is. So you double that, but nearly everybody's 300 times 2.
Yeah. Okay, now there's a few questions which I had really got, which were going to be directed straight at Caroline, who of course had to leave. But I'll still try some of these in case anyone does know. So one was a very good question about when the coroner says that a particular drug killed someone on their certificate. In fact, when I was reading Caroline's work, she had a very good paper on cocaine mortality, where one of the points she made was sometimes the coroner puts cocaine as the cause of death when there's at least an academic and medical debate about where if it's paired with a lot of heroin or strong opioid, it's probably a lot more the opiate doing the damage than the cocaine. But when we see the amount of deaths attributed to pregabalin, often in the context of polydrug use, often in the context of opiates, crack, of alcohol, of methadone, how much are any of the speakers confident that pregabalin is really instrumental in those tragic deaths?
Only when it's the only drug mentioned there, and you can be certain that there was nothing else there, wasn't previously metabolized or couldn't be detected post-mortem. That whole thing about, drugs mentioned on the death certificate, it in some ways it's useful, in other ways it can really hide lots of different things. So, for example, it's not about gabapentinoids, but you'll frequently see methadone on somebody's death certificate. But you may not see what actually really killed them was probably something that had nitazines in it and wasn't able to be detected, or some other things that were in there as well. But that leads, unfortunately, to this, in my perception anyway, this incorrect anti-methadone sort of stuff, which, methadone's a very vital drug. It's not even the best drug actually for opioid dependence. That's called diamorphine. But methadone does get a hard time, and I think unfairly, and it's because of it's a non-sophisticated way of interpreting what's put on drug-related death certificates. Back to pregabalin, yeah, you will probably see that there, particularly if there's been high doses used. But you always have to remain open to the possibility that there was probably other things there. But when you see an opioid and pregabalin together, yeah, you would fairly much say those are the two which are likely to cause the respiratory sedation, and therefore we're dead.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's a very important point that I think it is fairly opaque, the process by where coroners decide which drugs were the ones causing death. And I wonder if you get great variation amongst coroners and how well they understand causes of death. All of the science that Caroline was talking to us about, how gabapentinoids work on the body, how they might cause death. I bet there's great variation, and perhaps we should have a webinar on causes of death and get some coroners on to talk about how they do it and what mystic, how they do it, basically. One really interesting theme that's come up has been the idea of different drugs being prescribed at different times, therefore as more safe than previously used alternatives, and then the new one becomes perceived to be as or more dangerous. A question here from another anonymous attendee. I note that we keep living through cycles of pharmaceutically produced drugs that are deemed to have a lower risk of abuse and end up being widely used illicitly. Heroin maybe being the absolute classic, invented, seen as being heroic, and it was less addictive than morphine, and then it ended up being, the absolute poster of addiction through much of the 20th and a bit of the 21st century. So, returning to the question, is there work being done to assess how decisions on low-risk drugs are brought into the market these days and monitored before they become larger public health problems such as these? Well,
I have no papers or research from this, but I've 30 years experience. And every time I hear of the miracle drug, I go, oh shit. It's going to be far, far from it.
Yeah.
Without, wanting to get myself sued by a pharma company, I would say that there needs to be a lot more thought put in before drugs get licenses, particularly those that are used for some form of psychiatric effect, and in particular, and mostly for those which may be used in the treatment of addictions. I'm not against the use of medications at all. That's not what I'm saying. My general point is, the more we hear something being, the cure of all ills and evils, the less you should trust it.
Yeah, absolutely. I really agree with everything you've said. The more I read about drugs for, career life interest, the idea of the perfect drug, the problem-free drug. When in our history, what you'd say, antibiotics haven't caused a load of unintended harms, anti-inflammatories, insulin. I don't know if there's many other perfect drugs which haven't caused problems. And I know absolutely nothing about Ozempic, but my only thought of it is every time someone says it's perfect, I think, I just don't believe in perfect drugs. Let's just wait and see which way it manages to be not perfect. But, Natasha Morris has made the same point that I have been making indeed. Maybe Ozempic will be filed along antibiotic, penicillin and insulin and ibuprofen as not having side harms. Maybe that all those drugs have got side harms that I don't know about. But I think we're all probably getting a bit frazzled. So thank you very much all for joining. Thank you very much for all attending, all of the excellent questions.